Once there was a pond out in a desert between Jerusalem and Egypt. It was a beautiful oasis. Around its shorelines there were green grass, reeds, cattails, and there were large willow trees that provided shade and a cool, refreshing place for travelers to rest before they went on their journeys to Egypt. And in the middle of this little oasis was a solitary swan. They were not like you imagine them to be, for at this time swans did not look at all like they do today. They were not elegant and beautiful. They didn't have long, slender necks or the beautiful, white, fluffy feathers. They didn't have the strong wings. They were scrawny and weak. They had a stunted neck, and feathers were a dull brown and gray, black and white. And while this solitary swan would swim around in this little oasis of a pond, she would on occasion catch a glance of her reflection, but she would quickly turn away in distress, as she knew how much more lovely all the other birds were. The eagle had its large wings and formidable beaks. The hawk had its keen and brilliant eyes. And the geese, why, they had their downy, fluffy feathers to keep them warm. And even the clamorous crow had a handsome, sleek black feathers as its cloak. Why, she wondered, was she giving the castaway colors and the forsaken feathers of the bird kingdom? Year after year, the birds would stop in her oasis to rest, refresh themselves with a cool drink of water before they were off for cooler or warmer climates. And there were other migrant travelers that came through, merchants with their colorful camel caravans packed to the hilt with their fine silks, fragrant herbs and spices, their rare woods and precious stones. And boisterous troops would set up camp around the shores, laughing all night, getting ready to go off for pillage and conquest. But those groups would come back wounded and weary and strangely silent. Lonely wanderers and timorous beggars, clever thieves would also stop by in the silence of night. And all these travelers would come and go, while the swan swam around, bemoaning her deplorable appearance and her homely fate. One year, the rains were reluctant to give any rain. And the second year, even less rain. And by the third year, the clouds did not give any rain at all. And the desert became even more withered and dried up than usual. And the large oasis of a pond began to shrink. At one time it stretched out as far as the swan could see, but now it was no more than a small pool, not any bigger than her wingspan. And the birds that once stopped to refresh themselves didn't bother, and they just flew overhead looking for other greener pastures. And the merchants, the soldiers, the lonely wanderers, the beggars, and the clever thieves, why, they may only stop for a short moment to taste the brackish water before they were off looking for better sources. The poor swan was alone and solitary, and as the summer progressed, the pond grew to a puddle, and then only to just a few drops of water. The swan guarded over those few drops of water like they were a nest of eggs. For in those drops lay what little life she had left, and she feared greatly about what would happen if those were to dry up. One day, late in the summer, she saw a cloud of dust arise over the horizon. She knew that meant that there were travelers coming. But why? Why were they coming to her sun-baked dry pond? As they got nearer, she could make out, through the oppressive brightness and the wavering heat in the air, 3 figures, one of which was an old man with a white beard, who was walking alongside a donkey upon which sat a young woman with a blue cloak wrapped around her. And as they got closer, the swan could make out a 4th figure. Nestled down in the woman's arms was a little baby. And when the old man and the woman, the baby, and the donkey came to what once was the shoreline of the pond, the old man looked and began to speak in a very dry, withered voice, as dry as the withered grass under his feet. "Oh, Mary," he said, "look, it's just another parched pond. We will have to carry on." The swan ordinarily would have ran away for safety, but now it pressed down upon its precious drops of water. For he did not want to wait to find out if they meant him harm. The woman, she said, "Joseph, but how can we carry on? We have no strength. What will happen if we do not have some water, some cool drops of water? If we do not, we will probably perish in the desert before we reach Egypt." The swan listened to their words, but all the more bullheadish, hunkered down over her little nest of water. For that water was the only thing that lay between her life and death. It stretched out its neck and gave the strangers a little hiss to tell them to back away. But the woman climbed off the donkey, walked down to the old man, and then slowly began to walk toward the swan. The swan's heart began to beat. It was terrified, but it would not budge. It stayed firmly in place, guarding over its precious water. Instead, it stuck its head under its wing, tried to protect itself. The woman took the child, and she put it out to where the child with its little dainty hands could just ruffle up the feathers of the dull-looking bird. And the child gurgled in delight. And as weary as the woman was, she took the child up in her arms and she smiled and gave the child a kiss on the forehead. And despite the bullheadish swan, he couldn't help but just take a little peek from his wing. He looked up at the woman's eyes, and what the swan saw was 2 blue pools of water. They were more cooling and soothing than any water that she had ever seen before. "Drink of me," it seemed the eyes were saying, "and you shall never thirst again." The swan's feathers began to tingle and her wings began to strengthen. She knew what she had to do. She stood up off her little nest to reveal the hidden water. When the woman saw it, she desperately reached out her dry palm to scoop up some of that water and drink, but she did not have the strength to do so and stumbled. Then the swan took her bill and she sucked up some of that water, and doing the best she could, she stretched out her little stunted neck to just pour some of that water into the dry palms of the Mother Mary. Mother Mary took the water and she gave her little baby a drink, and then the woman drank, and then the old man. And then the woman walked up to her donkey, and the donkey gratefully drank the remaining drops of water. The woman mounted her donkey, and the man led the donkey and the child along the trail to Egypt once again. The swan watched them as the woman turned around and she said, "You shall always remember this day." And then they were obscured in the dust until they finally vanished away. And all that was left was the solitary swan in its sun-baked dry pond. There was nothing left of it. There was not even a drop. The swan was the only thing left of the pond. But later that evening, some clouds appeared in the sky, and it started to drizzle. And then more clouds came and covered the harsh sun, and it started to rain. And then the whole sky was covered in a blanket of clouds, and it poured down rain. And that swan reached up its bill toward the heavens and gratefully drank as much of the water as she pleased, as it cascaded over her body. The rain came for many days. All that night and all the next day, all the next night and day, and the following third day. And under her grew the little puddle again, and then a pool, and then the pond back to its original size. The grass began to green up, and the cattails cattails and the reeds came back to life, and all the trees around it became a vibrant green once again. Finally, the sun broke through the clouds, and a rainbow appeared over the pond. And it was at that moment that the swan noticed her reflection in the water. She didn't recognize it. She looked again. What? She was not the deplorable creature she once was. She didn't have the brown mixture of dull colors. She had a long, sleek neck. She had beautiful wings, and she had white plumage. And that is how the swans became the elegant and dignified creatures that they are today. But the swans have to be reminded, always be reminded of how they once were. And in order to do so, when they're hatched out as goslings, they still look like that dingy gray and brown, black and white color like the ugly ducklings. But at some point, they shed that homely raiment, and they take on the beautiful raiment that they have today. You see, that swan, long ago, when he made that sacrifice, stretching his neck out to pour that water in Mother Mary's hands, it made his neck stretch out and become beautiful and slender. And when he felt that tingling of compassion in his feathers, a surge of strength came into its wings. And when the child touched his feathers, why they turned as white as the bright snow on a sunny Christmas morning. The Solitary Swan by Eugene Schwartz.